of this book. It was a little hard to decide which part to read to you guys, mainly because the book has a very strange structure and is kind of contrapuntal or polyphonic in some ways. There's more than one voice in the book. There are two prominent voices, but certain others that sort of echo throughout as well. And the beginning of the book is very, very spare and minimal, and consists almost entirely of action. And the end of the book is, there is a kind of flowering of language. And so if I were to read from either the beginning or the end, you would get a very one-sided version of what this book is, which is really a kind of crescendo from small language to big language. So I'm going to read something that's sort of smack in the middle in the hopes that you'll get sort of a sense of both ends of the spectrum. If there's time at the end, I'm happy to read from a different section as well. But hopefully we'll have enough questions so that won't happen. So just to set the stage, the main character is a delivery boy. This is a parable. Nobody has names. The place where it takes place, an urban locale, is not named. You don't know if it's in the east or the west or where. There's the entire thing is non-specific. And so this delivery boy in this particular scene, gosh, I don't want to give too much away. He's gotten into some trouble and he has to take a particular delivery, the contents of which nobody knows. He doesn't know, the reader doesn't know. And he's got to take this delivery outside of his normal delivery zone to sort of points unknown. So this is just at the moment where he has been given this task and he gets on his bicycle. He wove among the cars, finding lanes that shouldn't have existed, spaces that were folded and unfolded by the flow of traffic. He knew every move of every vehicle on the street, and anticipating, made the most of it, cutting up the roadway in unexpected shapes, his bike a blade, and he found himself laughing at drivers, taunting other delivery boys. He leaned far to one side and then corrected to the other, never having to stop at lights, at crosswalks, never having to dismounting at intersections. He thought of this as a failure in a kind of child's game. And soon the way opened up. Looking ahead, as he coasted, he began to feel the neighborhood around him transform. But into what? All the streets and roundabouts he had become intimate with over those days and months, for who knows how long. Those streets that he had once believed would always be part of a disorienting and alien future. This old route was, perhaps now, becoming precisely that, old, scenery, part of the long unfurling of his past. Now he was moving towards something, and that something was getting it right. This, he concluded, was being a man about things, which meant insisting, and then accepting, no, embracing the penalties for such insistence, declaring one's feelings and being rebuked if necessary. This was it. Yes, there were new debts to be paid, and yes, the new path was not without peril. But the delivery boy now noticed a fresh excitement surge out from some subterranean spring, an excitement at traveling outside the tightly belted limits of his old circumscribed life. He was full up, ready, as if the world were suddenly and unaccountably available, affordable, proffered. In that moment, he felt nothing but this strange upwelling sense of agency. He released his grip, tucked his legs up, closed his eyelids slightly against the wind, and felt it play on his teeth and on the back of his throat. He opened and closed his mouth. And as he did so, the wind produced the snap of a bitten red, yellow, green fruit. The delivery boy saw the borderlands of his old neighborhood as a new series of discrete pictures, as if he were already transcribing the saga of his own great journey. A tall striped stack made out of stamped tin jutting out of the middle of the avenue, gouting smoke. He and the rest of the traffic divided around it and slackened, as if the street and all its noise, motion, and commerce, and even the delivery boy himself, were powered by currents of underground steam, which now leaking lost vital energy and slowed the entire apparatus. An old man, angled forward, bent almost in half as he walked. his hands clasped behind his back. A young man leaning against a lamppost, smoking. He had a dog on a leash. A young woman approached, bent down, and spoke to the dog. The young man took a last drag and flicked it away. The late afternoon sun perched directly on a chimney like an egg in an egg cup. A man flipping and dropping a coin while another man watched. A doorman sprang down the already wet sidewalk with a hose. 3 women gathered over a phone and smiled as if they were bending over a cradle. A man driving past him in a car that was shiny and yellow, and though the delivery boy thought the yellow was wicked, he wondered what it must be like to drive that car on days when the driver felt sad. A visibly crazy woman gibbering into a roadside help box. A man carrying a mirror across a street, which is to say an unexpected, if brief and blurred, portrait of a ragged, determined delivery boy. The wind against him, he chugged up a hill, and when he came over to the other side, he saw the neighborhood's main commercial street and the demarcation of its northern boundary. Coffee chain, tobacconist, appliances, purveyors of ladies' underwear, sporting goods, bath bombs, soaps, candy, computers, phones, and other electronic appliances, hotel, another coffee chain, fast food, t-shirts, another fast food, shoes, more clothing, more clothing, more clothing, a retail park, pub, makeup, mattresses, family restaurant, all fronted by glass display windows, people streaming in and out, chrome doors, thumping music leaking out with the air conditioning, double parked cars, always a hazard for delivery boys, and generally lawless sidewalks swarming with tourists and shopping bags, people bustling, arguing, sulking, a child wailing. The atmosphere here carried, like the atmospheres in municipal offices or waiting rooms, a mood of depleted power, the sense of a vital force having been sapped despite the outward prosperity of it all. The delivery boy felt the energy leach suddenly from his legs, and for a brief moment it seemed as though he might have to get off of his bike and rest. And he remembered how in the department store he had sat on one of the plush banquettes, but only for a moment, mirrors all around him, color everywhere, sounds bearing down, and the trouble he had had rising again. And after giving into that siren song of lethargy, which had overwhelmed him, the strong and suffocating lassitude. But not now. There would be no resting now, not with so much in the balance. So he shook his head, slapped one of his cheeks, and attempted to revive himself. He pedaled again. Several blocks later, at the next rise, he saw in the space between 2 large buildings a view from which he could see out farther. His head cleared instantly. The clouds ahead were massed into tall, pale towers against a yellowing sky. These clouds were north of the city. Imagining the blurred outlines of his destination out across the broad river, he then felt another new kind of longing. He turned off the power assist just so that he could feel his own muscles working. He needed the toil and he craved the horizon, and so he pedaled towards it. Skimming. He says you're stealing from him, N had reported. Good, thought the delivery boy. That fucker. He biked faster, working himself hard, not noticing that he had just passed the boundaries of the old neighborhood and had entered a new one entirely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't think we should recount that, the story of our friendship. Let's just say very quickly that we've known each other, since we were 8?
Second grade.
Yeah, second grade.
Let me just say that Brent and I our desks were next to one another in the back of, I think it was Miss Goodale's second grade classroom in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and we both drew robots and exchanged work with one another.
Even back then.
And then Brent disappeared for many, many years, and then we re-met in Paris, right? And someone was attempting to introduce us after this massive gap, and we just looked at each other and recognized each other instantly, even as grown-ups. And we've been friends again ever since.
Okay, we're not going to tell the whole story.
Okay.
Let's talk about this book. So please do jump into the chat and ask questions, and we are going to have a conversation for a little while, and then I will dip into the chat and pull your questions out in a half an hour or so. So please do throw out any questions you have for Peter. It's really a marvelous book, and it is hard to give, I mean, it's great to hear you read from it, but it is hard to give a sense of it. And I wanted to start by asking you, I'm glad you said that about the form, because I wanted to start by asking you to talk about the form. I think of it as a fugue form, because a fugue etymologically is a flight, and this is a novel about flight, cross-border migration, and especially because the characters, it seems to be a matter of political refugees, but also each of the delivery excursions, the delivery boy going out, it's each of them is a fugue in a certain sense. But also knowing you as a musician, along with all the other things you do, I think of it as, in terms of its structure, as a fugue in a musical sense. It has that dialogic interweaving, the call and response of because there's more than one migration story. You eventually realize there's an interweaving of migration stories. And I also think of it as a fugue because, as the narrator says at one point, 3/4 of the way in, makes this wonderful comment about a fugue in music, that a fugue contains, packed within its preliminary notes, the hereditary material for every note that follows.
Yes.
And the book kind of has that. It starts with this tiny little drip. It starts so small, and then it accumulates, this kind of snowball effect. It reminds me of what you, many years ago, you made me buy, back when there were big record stores like Tower and Virgin, and this was in Paris, the Glenn Gould, a live performance of the Sweelink organ fantasy.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like that. It starts out in quarter notes, and eighth notes is very stately, and then suddenly 16th notes, 32nd notes, it erupts. It kind of accelerates, and your book does that. How did you do this? How did you get the form?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of questions embedded in that question. First of all, can I just say, I'm so glad I'm doing this with you, Brent, because Sweelink would never come up in a conversation with anybody else. And by the way, y'all should go out and get those Glenn Gould early music performances, because they're brilliant. So yes, a fugue. I think it's not a fugue in this. I mean, as a musician, like, I think of a fugue as a pretty strict set of rules and strictures. This is more a fugue in the sort of Beethoven sense, that it's a much looser form, and also it has a kind of narrative. There's a kind of, there are architectonics to it that are different than the ones that sort of inform how a fugue progresses. What I mean by that is, like, the whole piece is kind of a crescendo of a kind. Like, it works from, I mean, you know, fugues begin with a single voice and then expand outwards. That's absolutely true. I think you could read this piece more like a kind of like a bolero almost, not in the sense of the Latin dance, but in the sense of the Ravel orchestral work, in that it just starts out with a single instrument, ends up with all of them, right? Or like a reverse Haydn farewell symphony. So there is that structure to it where it's just constantly growing. But yeah, like there are a lot of themes in the book. It's very hard for me to talk about this, because on some level I want people to enjoy the book just purely on its most narrative level, without doing that extremely annoying authorial move, which is like the look what I see what I did there kind of thing. Sarah and I were talking about this in terms of the last volume of Proust and Tolstoy, that urge to explain things that you did. But the truth is, there are a lot of structures in the book that may not be noticeable. For instance, there are only 3 colors in the entire book, and they're red, yellow, and green. They're traffic light colors, kind of Aleppo style restrictions that I put on myself, that enabled me in some way to have these kinds of repetitions, the repetitions of colors. There's certain words that repeat. There's certain thematic cells that keep recurring throughout the book. So even though the style of the book changes, in a sense, it should still feel, hopefully, like there's some unity there of form. The question of how I did it was really just, I was so I was so constrained in terms of time, and like, so this book was basically written in about 4 months. In the time in which I was waiting for Same Same to come out, it would have been the fall of 19, I guess, 2019, 2018. I can't remember, it's all blurring together. Anyway, I had very little time, and I remember thinking, well, if I just do something super like lapidary, if I just write maybe a sentence or two per chapter, I can sketch out a whole book that way and then just fill out the chapters later. And then I realized once I started doing that, that having started small and set up this sort of scenario in which this boy was leaving his sort of comfort zone and entering into this kind of new world at the same time as he was kind of enculturating himself into this new world, no matter how much it resisted him trying to become part of it, and that he was learning the language, as it were, of this world, that it made sense for the book then formally to respond to that by adding language. So it's supposed to map in some ways just the experience of language acquisition, you know, from its meager beginnings to its, you know, infinite endings. And you know, that's one reason why Wittgenstein is such an important sort of you know, presiding figure over this book, is his interest in what meaning is, how language is acquired, his investment in language was one of the guiding forces for me as I wrote it. And I might have told you this story, but the book in a way really comes out of a kind of strange coincidence that the way in which Wittgenstein described language acquisition in the philosophical investigations, quote, as the ability to go on, was the exact same phrase that my grandfather, who was a survivor, used to describe his sort of will to keep living and his ability to sort of overcome the extreme tragedy that had befallen his family in the Shoah. So the fact that they both had used this expression, you know, the ability to go on, was interesting to me. And I thought that there was some, that coincidence felt fertile somehow. So the idea of overcoming tragedy, entering as a stranger and a subaltern into this strange new society, and you know, on the bottom rung, and the fact that you have to acquire all the languages necessary to get off that bottom rung, the languages that are, you know, literally language, but also, you know, cultural capital and all these other kinds of forms of belonging. And so that is an extremely convoluted answer to a pretty simple question.
No, I mean, I asked a few questions packed together, but that the narrator calls it a capacity for moving forward toward the end of the book.
Yes,
That
exactly.
ongoingness is it really comes across.
And it's supposed to feel kinetic a little bit, like a kind of moto perpetuo that way.
Yeah,
That, you know, and I think in some ways, and again, this comes from my grandfather, in some ways that's kind of the only way to overcome tragedy, is this kind of investment in the future, and often concomitant inability to look backwards, you know.
yeah.
So the book is supposed to have that momentum.
Yeah, in that sense, formally, it reminds me of serial poetry, not serialism like 12-tone composition, but serial
Mm.
poetry, like George Oppin's book, Discrete Series, and Jack Spicer and Alice Notley, Ed Roberson. So it's not an epic. It's not like the cantos, history stuffed in between the covers of a book, but this kind of ongoingness that you've got one,
Yeah,
and then there can be a two, and you don't know what the last it might not end at 100. There's
right.
this kind of, that's why I use the phrase snowball effect, and it has that momentum to it. It's quite an incredible and impressive accomplishment.
I worried actually on that point. Sorry to interrupt you, but I
Go
worried a
ahead.
little bit that people who were just invested in, say, like the narrative, the sort of diegetic details of the book, that they would feel like the book slows when the language increased. It's been very interesting to just sort of take an informal poll, because I think there's some people who found that the end of the book was a far more vibrant and propulsive experience than the beginning of the book, which they felt was disorienting and kind of too minimal. And then you have exactly the opposite response. I just, it's interesting to me. I mean, I guess other than Portrait of the Artist, like I haven't read many works of fiction that are experimenting with the density of form in that way. And I guess as a visual artist, that's something that interests me too.
Yeah. Well, one more question. You can tell we're trying not to give the story away. one more question about form,
Yeah.
to be as abstract as possible. You know, how can I not ask you this? With what we see when we read, with the look of the book, what's the deal with all these? If you don't have the book yet, go buy it. But the first thing you notice is all the breaks.
Yeah.
The lines cutting these fragments and creating this kind of, you could almost describe it as it becomes a punctuation device. So you have these little fragments of language, and they could have been separated by asterisks or by space, but you use this line break that sometimes on pages you have 4, 5, 6 line breaks on a single page.
They're more impenetrable than an asterisk, which is easy to flow around. Your eye really has to stop if there's a firm barrier there. And in a way, I just really wanted each of those statements to be read, aphoristically, and not as, the way we read, like your eye is already saccading to the next thing by the time you've finished reading the first thing, or in the middle of reading the first thing, actually. Like your eye is almost constantly in motion, and you don't read information in discrete units that way. That's just not how we apprehend text. And so I was really eager to have each one of the sentences, especially at the beginning, I didn't want it to feel like a spaced out paragraph. I wanted it to seem like a series of very discrete and standalone statements. And I think that this sort of, the feeling of dislocation there was interesting to me. Like I wanted to give the reader that sense of, and that's exactly the thing when you enter some sort of new environment where you don't entirely understand, to use a Wittgenstein phrase, the rules of the game, as Wittgenstein would describe it. When you're in that position, whether you're a child and you just don't understand, or whether you're in a new milieu or whatever it is, there is that feeling of discombobulation, dislocation, and you are taking each bit of information as discrete because you lack the sort of high altitude ability to tie things together into a gestalt. So, I think about the times where I felt particularly alienated, which is actually pretty frequently in my life. And that's something that I just wanted to evoke. And, you can do that in a variety of ways. As it turns out, language is also visual. Like they're signifiers, but they're pictures also, and they're arranged on a surface. So you can make those choices about the rhythm and tempo by which people, read these things. So that was part of the point.
So that was part of the process, as a visual designer, thinking, okay, I could use an asterisk here, I could use a space, but no, a line creates the effect that I want. That was part of your process?
Yeah, definitely. They started out just as sentences, and then when I started to read the whole thing through, the beginning just moved too quickly in a way, and I just really wanted that attention given to each sentence, which is just a kind of, like neediness and vanity on the part of a writer. Like I think everybody, no matter what your paragraphs look like, wants your reader to just stop and pay attention to every word because you slaved over them and it really mattered to you, the ones you picked and the order you put them in. I'm sure you appreciate that feeling, Brent. So if you could just like be over the shoulder of every reader who is reading one of your books, you'd just be like, did you really give that the time it deserved? So it's sort of like it's like a kind of like restraining device, And what's nice is that they continue throughout the entire book, but the paragraphs get longer, so they don't feel as much like hard stops, I think, as the book goes.
I mean, it's interesting in terms of time. He's riding down the street toward the beginning of the book, and he describes I think it's the street lights as strobing. And
Hmm.
it is a kind of strobe light effect because they're not necessarily separated in time. It's not like this happened and then an hour later that happened. Sometimes you're in his head and it's one thought to the next. So, but the girls would come, line break. Surely, line break. And he could look, line break, right? You're just, and it's like the light flashes,
Hmm.
and you see with the strobe, you see the moment of illumination, and then it goes dark again. But it's not that an hour or a day or a week has passed.
Hmm. I
Um,
love that you pulled out that word. And I think that's actually totally right. I hope nobody gets a seizure reading it. But yeah, it's funny. Like, this is the first time I ever read any of it out loud, and I read a portion where there weren't a lot of line breaks. I'm very curious what it would feel like when it's audiobook time. How do you perform these things? Like, a novel is a very different thing read than spoken. Novels can be performed in a variety of ways, and I do wonder how that will affect um, how it's performed and received, because you're right, it would be very herky jerky and difficult to listen to.
yeah. Well, and it is the effect that's created is very, in terms of the medium, it's very visual. It's something that you experience visually, and then the accumulation or the propulsion that happens later when those lines occur less frequently.
Hmm.
I mean, there are other things going on that because it's also about the way you use parentheses. All these formal elements play out in the way the book unfolds and accumulates and culminates in this very complicated way, but it's visual. It's what you're responding to,
Hmm.
seeing it.
I think in a way it's just, I have a question for you actually, but before then, just to respond to what you're saying, I think in a way I was trying to find visual and weird orthographic solutions to a problem, which is that writing in a way can't be contrapuntal.
Yeah.
Um, and so, in a way, affecting the rhythm of the reading is what the line breaks were for. The parentheses were supposed to, I know, like David Foster Wallace, for instance, in his footnotes, like there are ways, but I never liked the fact that if you wanted that counterpoint, your eye had to jump to the back of the book or the bottom of the book to sort of hear the other voice. It seemed nicer to have it embedded. But it's tricky because then your memory plays a huge role there, because when you pop back into the original voice, then you have to be able to track what was. Anyway, it's a problem
Yeah.
I would like to solve, and I doubt that I will. But my question for you was on this subject, you know, when you asked how this form sort of came about, I was thinking also of a lot of books that I was reading at the moment at which I was writing this book, by which I mean, um, I was reading Jenny Ofel, I was reading The Argonauts, I was reading Roland Barthes by Roland Barthes. I was reading all these books that happened to have this very particular kind of way of structuring a story. And
Yeah.
I don't know why it is that in 2017 through 2020, all of a sudden novelists and auto theorists and everybody else started to write in these very, very small, discrete lumps. But it definitely happened. And I guess my question is, what do you think the genealogy of that is, and why? I mean, have you read any of these books, or are you aware of
Yeah.
this thing that happened all of a sudden?
I've taught a class about it.
Oh,
But,
well, perfect.
I'll send you the syllabus.
Okay, good.
Um, no, you could read it. I mean, there still are the totalizers, right? There still are the stuff it all in novelists, and there still are the narrative flow novelists. But I think you could read it as a reaction to the impossibility of totalization. You can't get your head around it all, and so you take it in fragments. But there is a formal genealogy to it. In the class that I teach, we go back to Walter Benjamin and Adorno's Minima Moralia and Nietzsche. There's a long lineage of writing, and Wittgenstein is another one. There's a long lineage of writing in fragments, especially in philosophical inquiry. So
Mm.
it's very possible to explore that and think about the way it becomes a space of exploration in contemporary fiction.
Yeah, and it's
Uh,
interesting, actually. Roland Barthes speaks a lot about Nietzsche in Roland Barthes by Roland Barthes, which of
yeah,
course is an auto theory. And that is the book in a way that I think most informed Argonauts in
Yeah.
many ways. And Argonauts is the book that seemed to most inform Jenny Offel's fiction.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that there's a traceable genealogy there. But that was
Yeah.
also something like, that's why I started out writing discrete sentences this way, is it just seemed like, hey, all the cool kids are doing it. What's this all about?
Well, maybe it all goes back to Roland Barthes. Yeah, I don't think everybody notices about Maggie Nelson, but the form comes directly out of the Roland Barthes by Roland Barthes and A Lover's Discourse.
Yeah. And I think you're right, Wittgenstein also, and I think like Bluet, Wittgenstein is mentioned overtly.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me that there is that kind of, almost like a scientific discourse in the sense that, I mean, it's not numbered the way the Tractatus is, but it has that kind of rhythm to it, you know? Yeah.
But before we jump off into the upper atmosphere, let me try to tie you down to the circumstances of the day, and the stuff that probably people who have read the book would be expecting us to talk about.
Yes.
I mean, I was saying to you before we started, you put a book out and you realize at a certain point it's going to have its own life, it's going to have its own career, and it's sort of out of your hands. You've delivered it, as it were, and it's going to be taken up the way it's taken up. But I wanted to ask you just to think out loud. This is a book, as you said, you wrote a few years ago. It coming out now, there's a way that the meaning, the intervention of a book can be radically reshaped by the circumstances of the moment it happens to come out. So it coming out now, during the pandemic, being read, at least what I've seen about it, as a parable of the essential worker and of the Grubhub, the Uber Eats, the seamless delivery, immigrant delivery worker, the electric bike delivery boy or man. Right. I know that since you were writing it long before the moment of the pandemic, that there must be some talk about disorientation or dislocation in terms of the uptake, the moment in which you were writing it, and now it's taken on an allegorical meaning that has taken it in a really different direction. I just wanted to ask you to
It's freaking weird, dude. I mean, yeah, that's exactly right. So when the book was written, I had a very, very vague and already allegorical sense of who this delivery boy was that was not pegged to a particular demographic or community. And it is very strange now to see this delivery community just, they were pretty much always there in one form or another, but it's very much front and center in our lives now that we absolutely depend on these people now. And, it was one reason why it was important for this to be a parable, is that I'm not speaking for a community. I'm not speaking for anybody invisible, quote unquote, or otherwise. This is not a book that's supposed to bring a population to light. Like, who would I be to do that? In a way, the question for me was more thinking through, I mean, I hesitate to use the word plight, but thinking through the plight of people whose lives are difficult. Where is, and knowing at the same time that one is not within one's rights to co-opt or colonize that story. Where is the point in which the empathetic imagination is allowable? Like, where is the in? Like, what is the moment and what is the mechanism by which we get to try to inhabit the lives of other people, which I actually think is an extremely important moral imperative, actually. And moreover, I think is just a fundamental part of perception as a whole, that we do in fact colonize every single moment that we perceive, just through the act of perception, and that the imagination plays a role there. And this is why it was important that there be a narrator in this book who, and there's several stories in the book that are being told or co-opted by several people. all the way down to there's this guy who works in the warehouse named Waj, who's sort of beneath the underdog. He's just as down and out as you could possibly be. And there's a scene where the delivery boy sort of is musing on, well, what's his tale? Where did he come from? And he himself gets kind of smacked down for the hubris of thinking that he could even imagine such a thing, and is confronted with the impossibility of imagining such a thing. I don't know if I'd go that far. I don't think it's impossible. Again, I think it's kind of a moral imperative. What's not a moral imperative is to claim that I speak for anybody, and I really super duper don't. And I think because of the circumstances around us, all of a sudden this book does seem to be about a very specific group of people. So on the one hand, that's kind of cool. On the other hand, it's kind of terrifying, and I didn't intend it. So back off.
And how do you sense that ethical limit? How do you gauge that line? How do you figure that out? I mean, how far are we allowed to go?
Yeah, I don't know. I really don't know the answer to that. For me, what I try to police to some extent is that the effort is being conducted in good faith, that I'm constantly aware of the limitations of the process, and am willing to be brought up short because of whatever implicit biases I have, but all the same time knowing that those biases of all kinds, not just political or ethnic or religious, but aesthetic as well, are again part and parcel of every single experience I have of the world, and that they're maybe malleable to some extent, but also pretty baked in. So for me, in a way, the book is really kind of a laying out of a kind of dialectic that plays out in my own mind when I have these moments of even just sort of unbidden, like the mirror neurons in me are responding to somebody else. And it might be their joy, but it might be their plight. And I wouldn't want to foreclose on that as an operational theater of human emotion. Like, I wouldn't want to say that that's off limits, because it feels important to our humanity to be able to, my daughter is asking me if I've read Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments. Yeah. Ruby. So, I mean, that's a very convoluted answer. I don't think there is an answer, honestly. But again, I think good faith is important here. And I also think that one can't let compassion die on the cross of not wanting to, overstep a boundary that might be politically fraught.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, and this has to do with the way it's a parable, that if the book offers an answer, it's through the way that limit is gauged in the narrator, in the way the narrator tells and is sensing the limit of what can be told about the delivery boy's story, which also becomes a way of the narrator working through his own story. And so it's actually interesting that I didn't understand how the narrator was functioning for a while, but the narrator is really the way that's gauged. How far can you go? And I think that the book is, I think it's subtle, but it's profound in that way as a parable, because it is about narrative as a technology of delivery. It's what happens when you carry a story.
Yes.
So that ethical question of how far you can go and whose story you have the right, quote unquote, to take, it's all embedded in the interplay between the narrator and the delivery boy whose story he's telling.
That's great, Brent. That was exactly the idea. That is the fundamental principle of this book, exactly. And I think, one of the points there is, even if you find that the stories that you're telling are bumping up against limits of various kinds, or if they simply aren't stories that you should be telling or able to tell, that whatever you do will be narrative on some form or another. And that there also is, and again, I hate to dwell on this part, but like this colonizing aspect, this idea of capturing something that isn't yours, and then stirring it into this pot of sense data and personal history and everything else that constitutes a person, that is in fact just what being is. And I do in fact think it's extremely important to be aware of the process so that you don't overstep. But the narrator really was, for me, in a way, the escape clause there. Like, he's the guy that gets to be like, he's my proxy, right? He gets to say like, whoa, you don't know that, you know? And at the end of the book, I think in particular, without giving anything away, and actually there's nothing to give away, it's very interesting. The ending is definitely a Rorschach blot, because people have told me both they found it like devastatingly tragic and extremely uplifting and happy. So choose your own adventure. But he does, at that moment, just, the sort of break right before the coda, he says, I'm going to get this wrong. I know I am. And I knew that I would too. And I think to not know that, and to some extent acknowledge it on the page, is a kind of dereliction of novelistic duty somehow. Yeah. I mean, others will disagree. And I think, if I could have written a book that was just straight action and character, I would have, but that ain't me. So here we are.
Well, I don't think I can say more about what happens in the third part without giving it away. And I want people to have the experience of going through it, and the shift that happens. So I won't say more about it, but it is, I don't think he's an out. I think the narrator is maybe a proxy, but it's not an alibi. It's you're testing this ethical question through the narrator.
Yeah.
So I think there is a serious point being made. I was going to ask you about language learning, because from that first epigraph, our language can be seen as an ancient city, all the way to the achievement of the term conversant and the achievement of fluency at the end. It is a book not just about migration, but about living in a new language. And having lived with you in a foreign country in a language that we didn't quite master, I think the book is about fluency. I mean, fluency etymologically means flow. It's about the achievement of flow, formally and thematically.
Yes.
And also about a lot of fun things related to language, like the particular pleasures of learning how to swear in a foreign language.
Definitely.
Whether the word is merde or asswipe.
Yeah.
It's a very particular.
Have an expression for that, unfortunately.
Asswipe. But you already said a little bit in framing it in relation to Wittgenstein about language learning. So I won't push you to go further there. Let me bring in some of the question. Or you want to go further?
Just very briefly, the only thing I'm going to say is that the form matters there, because in a way, Wittgenstein, like this, his second big book, which is the Philosophical Investigations, which is very much a repudiation of the first book, which is the Tractatus, which is a book that's very much about the way in which language maps life. Philosophical Investigations does not hold that belief that language can, in fact, map life. And the book begins with a sort of recounting of the sort of Augustinian view of language learning, which we call ostension, which essentially is like this idea that the daddy points to a tree and says tree, and then you're like, oh, tree. And that language is an accumulation of these tags that are put on the world. So some of the limits of language, some of the sort of Aleppo style limits that I put on the beginning of the book, are pointing towards this very specific idea of ostension and that way of learning language. And then the rest of the book gets more into language as a language game or a form of life, or meaning being use, which is another important thing to Wittgenstein. So in a way, the book really is a kind of like mind experiment in which some of these these principles that he was playing with, some of which are actually, it's unclear actually what he meant by some of them, including like the idea of the ability to go on is very controversial in terms of, people's understanding of his meaning there. But the book really is a playing out of the Philosophical Investigation. So those aphorisms weren't just like to add a little like, sweet, sophisticated imprimatur to it. I mean, that's one reason why I put the attribution at the end, because I thought anybody that opened a book and there was an aphorism by Wittgenstein at the front of it would just be like, oh, this guy's such an asswipe, and just wouldn't want nothing to do with it. Now we can go to the questions. Sorry.
Let's see. I don't know if everyone can see the questions. I guess I'll just read them out loud. Michael Theodore, I think it's fair to say that same and the delivery are quite different from each other. How would you characterize the differences, and is there any story you'd like to tell regarding the distinct approaches between your two novels?
Right, that's a great question, Michael. The like same I think is very much just like full on maximalism. Like it's, everything is just shoehorned in there. And I think that's probably just like a first novel disease. Like you just, this sense that you've got to put everything like interesting or smart that you've ever thought into the book. Otherwise it'll be lost time. And what a crime that would be. So that, I think same in a way is just really, it's just more encyclopedic in that way. It's just including a lot of stuff, both from my mind and the minds of others. It's just crammed full of junk. And that's on purpose. And same definitely has a different form. I mean, the delivery, the idea behind the delivery was really to, in a way, same is a kind of anti-novel. There are no characters in it. There's no drama. Nothing really happens. It's just antagonistic to the reader in a million different ways. The delivery, at least, was supposed to have a story that would be a Trojan horse for my weird ideas. So same is just like balls out craziness. So that's really the biggest difference. I mean, I would say that the similarity is that they're both very concerned with just the weird phenomenology of being in the modern world, like just how we are as humans, how we perceive it, how it comes at us, how it's constantly mutating, how disenfranchised and alienated we feel one moment to the next. Like, these are common themes. I'd be lying if I said that these weren't preoccupations of mine, because I feel that way quite often, and I do. So it's like there is something that's also satisfying when you write a book about, say, simulacra, and then all of a sudden we're doing book meetings on Zoom, and then you write a book about a non-existent demographic of delivery people who then all of a sudden appear. I'm starting to get that strange, uncanny feeling that I believe Stephen King wrote a book about this, where someone writes those things and then they become so. I hope that answers your question, Michael. There was a question from...
Oh, there's some more.
I think if you even go, let's see, all the way back to the top, there was something about design, I think. And
yeah, Judith Blotnick, how does your eye as a designer, a really, really good one, inform your writing and vice versa?
Thank you.
I already was getting you to talk about the visuality of it, but maybe in terms of shifting gears, I know that as a cover designer, you read a lot of novels to think about the themes or the icons or the topics or the motifs to bring out in the design. But it's not every cover designer that's then going off and writing a novel or two. So what is it, how, maybe that's, maybe there is more to say about that. How does your eye as a designer impact or inform your writing?
I think it informs the writing more in terms of process than in terms of sort of final result, in as much as those two things could be separated. I think, design has taught me in many ways to just not take myself that seriously as somebody who makes things. I mean, when you're a designer, most of the stuff you're making, you're sort of a parasite on someone else's work. There are all these vectors at play, commercial and otherwise. And you realize the thing you're making is not fine art. It's commercial work, and it can be good, but it's not, there isn't the same sort of gravitas around design as there is around sort of novel writing. And I think, in the past, before I was a designer, when I would try to write fiction, I would be very stymied by sort of that feeling of, the weight of seriousness around the project. And the nice thing about designing is you just kind of learn that making anything can be simple in a way. Like design is, you make a square, you make a circle, you draw a line, you throw some type down, you move it around. It's a kind of sandbox. And I think one of the things that I really loved about design as a practice is that I could keep it simple in that, as a, psycho-emotionally, I didn't get that invested in a way that I got bogged down or overly complex about what I was doing. And somehow I just felt that process was just, it then entered into the writing process. Like, oh, here's a sentence. I could write another one. I could write 10 more. I don't even need them. Like, maybe I'll write it this way. Maybe I'll write it that way. There's a kind of lightness, I think, about the process that enabled me to do it. So it was kind of a thin end of the wedge thing. I mean, when I go back to design, which I very, very rarely do now, if ever, I have found that the writing doesn't influence the design in the slightest. All this writing I've done has been totally beside the point. But I do find that the process of designing has been valuable for me. And in fact, I'll also add that when you're working long form, I mean, Delivery is a short book, same as a long book, just in terms of word count. And when I was working on Same, the thing that I found most handy to do is something that I used to do when I was designing covers or albums or whatever, which is to print the thing out really small and stand back from it. And I actually would do that with the novel. Like, you can you get to know what your paragraphs look like even at a distance when you're so just immersed in the process. And what I would do is I'd print out the whole thing, I'd put it up on the wall, and I would then all of a sudden get a kind of sense of where the book was. So there was a literal tool that I used from design that actually I found very useful. Sometimes I'll even put things in color just thematically to be able to remember sort of what I was trying to do in a particular passage that I'm writing.
That's interesting in terms of process. I've been informed by the powers that be that we have time for one more question. So you see there are a few there at the end. Do you want to pick one of the last couple?
I think I could probably do Harry T. Edwards and Finn Cameron pretty quickly.
Okay.
I like the idea that the book is akin to poetry. I think that that's a wonderful thought. I mean, because of the condensation of meaning that there is in poetry, and I like to think is in this book as well. Refer back to Brent's comment about Fugue, but also the kind of attention that's given to the reading of poetry. Like, you really need to attend to it. You can't be distracted when you're reading poetry because of that condensation of meaning. So I'd like to think, I mean, I flatter myself to think that maybe the book has moments that have that same feeling, that you need to you have to bring that attention to it. Finn says the development of pronoun usage was pretty pronounced in the draft I read. Has this remained, and is this directly related to the acquisition of language in some ways self? Yes. All the language, including pronouns and prepositions and adverbs in particular, develop as the book goes on. So that is a very conscious choice on my part to make the beginning of the book rudimentary in many ways, other than those parentheticals, which are given a little more license. But even they start out more simply and become more ornate as the book goes on. I mean, I like to think. I mean, this really was a Joycean conceit because, I was thinking, I mentioned Portrait of the Artist, but also, there's the hospital section in Ulysses, Oxen in the Sun, right, is the one that moves through the history of literature stylistically as the chapter progresses. I just think that's an interesting move. And anyway, I hope that answers your question, Finn. And I think we might be at time.
Yeah, I think Maris is coming back on.
But not with a hook or anything. that was delightful. Thank you so much. And thank you to the audience. Once again, the delivery is available to order from McNally Jackson. This has been a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. And thank you in particular, Brent. It was really nice to talk to you and see you. And to McNally Jackson, you guys go out and buy books there. And I appreciate all of you.
Thank you. And congratulations.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Night.